Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Kara Cooney's lecture. Just waiting for a few people to come in to join this lecture and for my barking dog to exit the room. It's my great pleasure to host Dr. Kara Cooney's lecture this evening. The AIA's Archaeology Hour is a free public monthly webinar series that was created by the Archaeological Institute of America. My name is Sarah James. I am president of the Boulder AIA Society and a professor of classical archaeology at the University of Colorado Boulder. As you may already know, if you've been following this series, local societies like ours have been asked to host, and we're delighted to be included in this program. The AIA's Boulder Society reflects the community's intense interest in archaeology of all regions, as well as the university's active sponsorship of fieldwork projects. Our connection with the archaeology of the American Southwest is particularly strong, stemming from the early 20th century and our famous archaeologist, Earl Morris, who both attended CU Boulder and later became a teaching professor here. Born in New Mexico in 1889, Morris documented and excavated sites in the Four Corners region during the 1920s and 30s, developing a keen portrait of life before the arrival of Europeans. While exploring, Morris typically wore a brown leather jacket and a fedora that perpetually shadowed his face. Looking at this photo of him, one can understand why local legends say that he was the model for the iconic Indiana Jones character, although there are other contenders. One key difference between Indy and Morris, however, is that Earl's wife, Anne Axtell Morris, was a trailblazing archaeologist in her own right. The AIA Boulder Society offers 8 free public lectures every year from September to May, all of which are now hybrid, so anyone from anywhere can attend. This fall, we hosted speakers who discussed the research on tombs at Gordion in Turkey, the Pinson Mounds in Tennessee, and early temple architecture in the classical Mediterranean. Next week, Dr. Lini Mazurek is going to give a lecture on the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis in Greece. We hope you'll join us for this and our other spring lectures. You can find our monthly lectures on the main AIA calendar page and on our society's Facebook page if you would like to follow us. We're only able to present such an ambitious series because of our members. Membership in the AIA supports a wide variety of archaeological work around the world, from local societies to grants for excavation and conservation projects. Another way to support the AIA is by making a direct donation to the annual fund. All gifts, large and small, go a long way. They enable programs like this one, the Archaeology Hour, and further the general mission of the AIA to fund archaeologists and their work to recover and protect the past. As we begin this lecture, I will remind you that it is being recorded for later posting on the AIA's main site, but audience members may not record any segment of it. This is a matter of intellectual property rights, and we ask that all attendees respect this policy. Tonight's lecture is part of a full program of ritual lectures by leading archaeologists. As you can see here, more information can be found on the AIA's main site of archaeological.org. Tonight's lecture is part of a kind of double series that all of these leading archaeologists are involved with. The companion series to the Archaeology Hour is Archaeology Abridged, and its next lecture is by tonight's speaker on January 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can sign up through the same process that you signed up for tonight's talk. February's virtual lecturer is MacArthur winner Joan Breton Connolly of NYU, who will present her exciting research on Cyprus with both an Archaeology Hour and the Archaeology Abridged series. This evening, Dr. Kara Cooney is presenting The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. Dr. Cooney is a professor of Egyptian art and architecture in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Culture at UCLA. She's a very active scholar, publishing numerous monographs and articles, and a public academic sharing the glory of Egypt with wider audiences. Her popular books include The Woman Who Would Be King, Hatshepsut's Rise to Power in Ancient Egypt, and When Women Ruled the World, Six Queens of Egypt. In 2005, she was co-curator of the Tutankhamun and the Golden Age of Pharaohs exhibit at the LA County Museum of Art. Later, Cooney produced a series, Out of Egypt, for the Discovery Channel. And most recently, she's a host of an Apple podcast. It's amazing. Afterlives of Ancient Egypt, that features discussion on Egyptian history, society, and more. She is truly an impressive and expansive scholar, and it is my great pleasure to introduce her tonight. Please welcome Dr. Kara Cooney.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, AIA. Let's get my content shared. Everyone pray to the internet gods. A little quick prayer. Thank you, internet gods. Does it? Yes. Okay. It was great seeing where everyone was coming in from. Looks like a great crowd. And people from Hawaii all the way to Australia, and a lot of people staying up late in New York. So let's get to it. I promised them that I would stop on time. So let's see how we do. So we're jumping in with a discussion of absolute power in ancient Egypt and today. And my work is always trying to make the ancient past relevant. Otherwise, why do we do what we do? It's always making the point that histories are constructed. There is no such thing as a pure and clean apolitical history. Does not exist. And so from that vantage point, let's jump in to all of these rulers. Now, the idea that we would divinize rulers in ancient Egypt is not that weird. You think of that and you're like, yes, the god king. And we'll talk more about that. But the idea that we divinize rulers in other parts of the world is a little, well, you know, Alexander the Great, little bit. Yes, Augustus, he's kind of a goddish figure, but not really, not like Egypt. And that's kind of where I'm trying to push things a little, to talk about what divinization of a ruler means and what Egypt can teach us on that score. So Egypt excels at presenting the ruler with the best optics. They package their ruler, they manage their ruler, they have publicists that are better than any of our publicists. And in the ancient world, people like Alexander the Great, people like Mark Antony, Julius Caesar before him, Hadrian, they looked to ancient Egypt and thought, how can I get me some of that? How can I, in my complicated competitive world that thinks kings are bad, how can I pull in some of that kind of thinking and material? So with that in mind, do you think you have a king? Is that something that you agree is part of your world or not? What is a king? Well, as we work within a more competitive, oligarchic, corporatocracy, whatever you want to call what we live in, we can say, using evidence-based studies, that authoritarianism is on the rise in our country. And you can say that the founding of the United States, using Black bodies to build it and stealing land from Indigenous people to build it, is something that demands an authoritarianism behind it. And that is very much the foundation of our country. So maybe we have a little bit to learn from Egypt, maybe we don't, and we'll figure this out as we go and have a discussion. But we do divinize rulers as well. And if you are paying attention to the polarized American political landscape, you will note that there are past presidents who belong on one side of the political spectrum and presidents who belong on the other side of the political spectrum. But they become mythologized, divinized, perfected. These are things that Egyptians did very well. And that's where this book comes in. Got a copy right here next to me. This book has not necessarily created friends among Egyptologists around me, but it was a book that I felt absolutely driven to write. And I start the book off with a banger of a line where I say that I am a recovering Egyptologist. And then I go from there, that we can fall in love with these pharaohs because of the beautiful things that they have created and not realize the dirty underbelly of all of those creations. I want to bring the caveat to the fore that this is not a takedown of Egyptian culture. It's not a takedown of Egyptian religion. These are beautiful things. There are beautiful things of this culture. This is a takedown of how we use religion, how we use ideology to obfuscate what men in power are actually doing. And that's what this discussion is about. Now, Egypt provides us with an extraordinary gift. And that gift is that it's weird looking. There are gods with animal heads. There are kings who have green skin. They're all holding these weird crooks and flails, and they have all these bizarre hats. And we look at it and we go, well, that's not like us. And so when you see kingship here, when you see the divinization of a ruler here, you know what it is. It's clear. It's like, oh, okay, I can see that. But when it's in your own world, when it's the water in which you swim, then maybe the suit and tie of the oligarch corporate leader is not something you see as authoritarian, but that's just the uniform that is acceptable to us for us to keep our innocence, to use a James Baldwin phrase. I would point out that there are many rulers around this globe who use democracy, the ideals, the tenets, the laws, the constitutions, as an ideology, a fictional ideology, but it is presented to the people as the highest ideals of what you can have. And so there are authoritarians out there who are holding free and fair elections, and I use scare quotes there, who are claiming that the people are deciding when actually we're talking about a populism. So these are things that, yes, the worlds are different. Yes, the religions are different. Yes, we're thousands of years apart, but we are dealing, in my opinion, with very similar patriarchal systems of power, holding power among a few men, and working with that power through its rises and falls, which we will discuss. Now, the Egyptians, they created arguably the most ideal superhuman king, with the size of a superhuman king. And here you have a colossal statue of Ramses II from Memphis. The Egyptians created a monumentality of kingship that we cannot look away from. These beautiful pyramids, hypostyle halls, temples that continue to astound us. These kings created a continuity that went on for millennia. Egyptian culture lasted for 3,000 years with the same political system, same language, same religion, all of these things virtually unchanged. Now, that's a big statement. I work with these 3,000 years of history. Obviously, there are changes throughout the whole span of it. And yet at its elemental core, we're talking about the same type of political structure from the beginning to the end. The king is thought to have a divine body. This is expressed differently in the Old Kingdom, as you see in the Khafre statue on the left, from the New Kingdom, as you see in the Amenhotep III image on your right. But that divine body, a body of the gods, a body that is merged with the gods, even though it's going to die, even though it's frail, this is something that is communicated through Egyptian temples, texts, other kinds of media. This king, with his divine body, with his connection to divinity that others don't have, can create brutality against enemies, against foreigners, and that brutality is justified. In the same way that we might say, we must kill this man because he committed a heinous crime, and then we stick a needle in their arm and create a very strange and justified brutality, but that's a different discussion. So we have a stereotypical strong leader who uses his body through space and time to show his authority over his people. And I love the image of Putin on horseback with his naked chest, because I do think it aligns well with Thutmose III. Unless you think, oh, the king always has to be able-bodied, by no means. You can have a president who suffered from a disease in his early adulthood such that he could not walk. And here you see Roosevelt, who liked to sit behind the wheel of a car because it gave him that manly je ne sais quoi, that ability to go out into the world and show his power. So in short, we are dealing with a patriarchal system with the authoritarian leader at the head, but without the patriarchs below, without all of those elites who are supporting him, that authoritarian leader would be nowhere. So this is very much a connection, an agreement between elite and king, a balance between oligarchs and then the leader of the oligarchs at the top of the social pyramid. And we are ourselves very much seduced by these authoritarian kings. We pay big money to go see these blockbuster exhibitions of Tutankhamun and other ancient kings. We fork over all kinds of dollars, and I helped to curate one of these exhibitions with solid gold things, and people want to know which ones are solid gold, which ones are wood, as if we own them somehow too, as if they are ours. And then we buy things in the gift shop as if we've just attended a Rolling Stones concert or something like that. Now, I'm going to be talking about 3 kings. In the book, there are 5, but there's no way that I can discuss all of them, and I already have to end in too short a time. So this is just to give you a very brief breakdown of the chronology. And we'll start out with one who is very well known to you, Khufu. Then we'll move on to Akhenaten, and then we'll end with Ramses II and a big wrap up of what does all of this mean and what are we to do about it if we can do anything about the system in which we find ourselves. Now, Khufu is the builder of the Great Pyramid. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this. And for more information, of course, you can read the book, but I'll create a synopsis by claiming that this pyramid is not built because Khufu could build it. This pyramid was built because he had to build it. It was in many ways a pyramid of necessity. This was a 4th dynasty king, not a 1st dynasty king. This wasn't a king who was making a big splash at the beginning. This was a king who had seen kingship wane over the generations, who needed to reconstruct himself, who needed to reinvent himself, reinvent kingship. And indeed, Khufu was not the one who started on this journey. It was his father, Snefru. And here you see the 3 tries of Snefru to get the first straight-sided pyramid built. We have the bent pyramid, we have the pyramid at Meidum on the left, the bent pyramid in the middle, and then over to the right, the red pyramid at Dashur. And the amount of stone blocks and the manpower, the time, the labor, the amount of energy that went into this exceeded the energy that went into the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Khufu was a recipient of all of his father's trials and tribulations, research and development. And so we come to this idea of the pyramid, and imagine that you're an ancient Egyptian living there. Maybe you're an elite, maybe you're a sub-elite. You know, you can read and write, you don't have a super job, but you're doing okay. You got your job from your father, and you see this pyramid going up on the landscape, and to your eyes, it is the most modern space age for our words. It's the most modern thing you can possibly imagine. How could such a thing be built? And you're watching it from the city of Memphis grow along the landscape. You know that there are men bringing blocks there, but you can't imagine how it could happen. Maybe you go and visit and you see the blocks being moved into place and you're still like, oh my, how? How are they doing this? And you were impressed. You think the king is something beyond your wildest imaginations of divinity. He must be talking to the gods. This thing is creating the idea of an uber human beyond anything that you can comprehend in your head. This pyramid, in my opinion, is a weapon of stone. It is a weapon of the mind built of stone, and it still works on our simple human brains today. All you have to do is turn on your History Channel, look at ancient aliens, listen to what they say about the pyramids being built by the lost city of Atlantis or aliens coming from outer space. It doesn't matter. The point is, pyramids in our minds today, we look at them and we go, well, it can't be done. There's no way. This must be uberhuman, superhuman, beyond human. Somebody connected with the heavens, like an alien, must have built this thing. And Khufu did this, or Snefru before him did this, with intent. This was done to work upon humans' minds. And those humans could be elites, or they could be sub-elites, or they could be regular peasants just out farming the land. Trust me, you're going to want to work with those elites more. They have more say over what you can do in this world. Now, here's the cool thing about all of this, the tricky part. As soon as Khufu builds this pyramid, or by building the pyramid, the very act of constructing this pyramid, to do so, to create the research and development, to go through the trials and tribulations, he must empower, employ, fund, make rich a whole stratum of elites. Elites who are now going to find a new place in the Egyptian world. And once they have this place, they will not give it up. And so it is one of the biggest ironies in the story, and we'll see this again and again repeating itself, that as soon as the king grabs the most power to himself and says, I am a god, it is the moment that he loses it. Because by building that power to such an extent, he cannot do it alone. And he relinquishes that power to the elites around him. The argument is more carefully explicated in the book, but we'll leave it there. It is this elite empowerment that the king will be working against in the decades and centuries and millennia to come as kingship develops in ancient Egypt. Now, we are skipping Senwosret III, who really did have to fight those elites back and try to pull his power from them. But we're going to move to Akhenaten, well known to most of you for being the inventor of Egypt's first monotheism. Now, we can argue about what monotheism is. Is this monotheism? We'll discuss it as we go. But let's look at how this story developed in the Egyptian landscape. I always say that only in Egypt could a king get away with such excesses. Only in a place that enjoyed status quo, didn't have to deal with invasions from the outside or too much competition from the inside, could a king come up with this scheme, this new religious idea, this new persona, this new look, and get away with it without being assassinated. This guy rules for 17 years altogether. He starts out with the traditional name of Amenhotep. He is the fourth with the name of Amenhotep. And he changes his look. He changes himself. He reinvents himself. And to reinvent himself, like Madonna, like a rock star, he has to change all of the religion around him. And while textbooks and coffee table books about ancient Egypt say that this was a religious revolution, I would strongly push back and say this is no grassroots movement. This is a top-down religious imposition created by the king. Its main tenets and texts written by the king. This is the king's idea to aggrandize himself, to support his own absolute power. This brings up the idea of monotheism. And while I will not say that monotheism in and of itself is associated with authoritarianism, I will say that in this case, if you argue that this is a monotheistic type power, it was invented specifically to support absolute power. Works better. Monotheism is you're either with this religion or you're against this religion. There is little nuance. There is no gray space. And that works very, very well to hold power within a society. If you disagree, you can just look at your book of Second Kings and get an idea there. Now, this king was allowed to implement extraordinary change. And you can see that he changes his religion to focus on the sun disk in the heavens. And here he is worshiping a figure of Ma'at, who is the goddess of truth. And you might say, this isn't monotheism. There's a goddess, the goddess Ma'at, underneath the Aten, who is the sun god, not monotheistic. And I would say, he says there is only one God. Is he offering the idea of monotheism? Is he offering the idea of truth to this one God? what's actually happening here, because the oneness of it is very explicit in his texts. And I'll add that my full name is Kathleen Mary Cooney, and having grown up Roman Catholic, you know, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, not to mention the Virgin Mary and all of the saints, can be considered monotheism, because really it's polytheistic in practice. This works for me. I'm okay with this system being considered monotheism. But this is one of those big bar fights among Egyptologists. If you want to start a bar fight, you go in there and you say, was Akhenaten's religion monotheistic? And then just creep away slowly and see what happens to everyone left at the bar. But this guy, this Akhenaten, who changes his name, we'll look at it, is engaged on a journey of shock and awe. He wants to change his look to something that is hit by the sun and creates a body that is of the sun. And I talk about this in more detail, that the strange look that you see is a body of light. It's not a body with Marfan syndrome or Froelich syndrome or whatever people say he had. It's a body that is displayed to his people with the light shining behind him. And imagine, like, for those of you old enough who saw Close Encounters with the Third Kind, and the aliens come out of the ship and their necks are all narrow and they look all weird and elongated and bizarre. It's because they're backlit by this bright light. This is how Akhenaten is presenting himself to his people. He is presenting himself when the light is strongest behind him, either at dawn or at sunset. He is a being of light himself. Again, that divine body that the Egyptians were always looking for. Now, he changes his look, he changes the religion, and he changes the capital. So he leaves and defunds the capitals of Memphis, Heliopolis, Delta capitals. There's no one capital in Egypt. Thebes, of course, is also left behind to fund itself as it can. And he moves to a new space that he says is occupied by neither god nor goddess, out in Middle Egypt. And this place is called Akhet-Aten. His new name is Akhen-Aten. It is as if God and new city are one. So his divine body is a city. His divine body is light. It's very clever, the things that he is doing. And he takes on a new name. He moves away from the name Amenhotep, and he takes on the name Akhenaten, the Aten. I am the one effective for the Aten. And in a sense, he's the servant of the Aten, but he is like the manifestation of the Aten. He is the effective way of bringing the Aten into this world. And the god at the same time also receives cartouche names. And it was Don Redford who argued this, that Akhenaten's religion lowers the level of divinity and raises the level of kingship. So they are on par with one another. King and God both have cartouche names. They are very similar, almost indistinguishable. And he preaches a kind of prosperity gospel. For those of you living in the United States right now, this would seem about right. If you hang out in certain circles where the richer somebody is, the more blessed by God they seem to be. And here you see one of the many images from his temples. You see his temple space filled with altars, covered with food, haunches of beef, pieces of bread, all of these vegetables, geese that have just been slaughtered, just all piled high. In these temples, without roofs, open to the sun, so the sun can consume it. This was a way of, in a sense, showing as much money as one could to their people, saying, you want any of this, you come through me. So this is very much about funding, money, showing people the cash so that you have control over your elites and what they do or say about you. So we are dealing with a new and co-opted elite. And I love this scene from one of these elites' tombs. And you can see Akhenaten, his wife, his chief royal wife, Nefertiti, many of their daughters. And here they are throwing out solid gold trinkets to these grateful recipients down below, who are all bent over at the waist. They cannot stand erect in their king's presence. And this is a quid pro quo, presented very, very clearly. You give me this, I give you that. And everyone's like, okay, we're in agreement. And many of the people whom he elevates are new men. So a social historian might call them. A new man would be someone disconnected from a patrician family of old, without a long lineage to connect back to. Many of these new men are indeed from military, mercenary backgrounds, because the king needs people who are hungry for a different kind of power, who are hungry for him, and it will help move these old elites aside. Now, as you look at Akhenaten's extraordinary religious changes, they were destabilizing for Egyptian society, but they were also destabilizing for the people that he brought with him to this new capital of Akhenaten. And bioarchaeologists have just recently discovered multiple graveyards that show women, children, men, laborers who had worked malnourished, worked with chronic injuries, worked even with acute injuries. They look at the bodies, and I've talked with many of these bioarchaeologists. The most well-known would be Gretchen Dabbs, D-A-B-B-S. And these bioarchaeologists tell you that this is what bodies look like in work camp conditions and gulag type conditions. And there is even a graveyard of children separated from adults with similar injuries. So building this city was no easy feat on the Egyptian population. There is something else going on. Now, with all of that negativity, there is at the same time a religion of light, a religion of love and beauty. And I've bolded one section of the great hymn to the Aten, which is ostensibly written by Akhenaten himself, distributed to his elites, put into their tombs to show their loyalty. Remember, this kind of religion is very much a litmus test. You're either with me or you're against me. It's a way of testing loyalty. That doesn't mean there's no fervent, heartfelt belief in these religions. Generally, when such ideologies come along in any society, they take from the parts of the society that are most fervently held and believed. And that is why they can be so long lasting. That's why you can get people to do things that might be considered immoral or even cruel. So if you look at the first lines of this, we're discussing the new god, the Aten. New, not exactly. Yes, this god has been around since the Middle Kingdom, but new in stature and new in its connection to the king. And so we read, how numerous are your works, though hidden from sight, unique God, there is none beside him. You mold the earth to your wish, you and you alone. So I understand those Egyptologists who say this isn't monotheism. There's Ma'at, there's Re-Harakti, there's all these other divinities depicted. I do understand that, but I will also say that monotheism cannot be created at once and out of whole cloth. This is a slow development by a king whom I argue is creating political he's creating his own political machinations out of this new religion. It's not going to be created in one blow. He's going to create parts of it from what people know. Then he'll take some of those parts away and he'll purify it as he goes. He'll clean it as he goes. I can't expect the first monotheism on the earth to all of a sudden be what we would expect it to be in a Judeo-Christian Islamic mindset. It is only later in Akhenaten's reign that we see the iconoclasm that is so well known. And the iconoclasm, it goes after divinities and elements that he had allowed, Akhenaten had allowed to exist on the landscape earlier, and that he then wiped from the landscape when he felt, no, this is no longer serving my authoritarianism, my power, my kingship. And so he removes, in particular, the name of Amen, the figure of Amen or Amen-Re, and the word for gods, plural, divinities, that is chiseled away from temple after temple on the Egyptian landscape, which is a very interesting thing. Amen-Re, king of the gods, this is somebody who could compete as a solar divinity against the Aten. So he had to be removed. But this idea that the plural of gods needed to be removed does impose to me this idea that there is one God, one true God in Akhenaten's estimation, and it was the Aten. So here's that statement that I say. I'm not saying that every practicing monotheist is an authoritarian. I am saying that monotheism was specifically invented to support authoritarianism. There, you can find it on page 209, and you can go to town. You can ask me questions about it. It'll be great. Now, there's always going to be an unintended consequence, right? Khufu builds the pyramid. The pyramid ends up biting kingship back because it creates an empowered elite against which the king cannot fight over the long term. Very similar situation here. The king creates a new religion that he is the leader of. All well and good, but to impose that religion and to get people to follow him, he empowers a military elite unlike ever before. A military elite that ends up taking the kingship after him. This is indeed where the Ramessid family comes from. So the 18th dynasty will end with Akhenaten's strange religious machinations, and it will move into the 19th dynasty with the family of Ramses the Great, or Ramses II, and his populist, more militarily, institutionally based ideals. And now we're on to our last king, and we got about 10 minutes. So, let's see, 8 minutes. Let's see how we do. Now, Ramses' family comes from mercenary origins, and he tells us this himself. He tells us this on the 400-year stela, that his grandfather and great-grandfather were soldiers, and they were generals. They were important men. And he tells us they come from the northeastern delta, which is where Levantine people would move into Egypt and settle and connect with the Egyptians. These are time periods of very porous boundaries between what is Egyptian and what is not Egyptian. Can't expect anything different, but it means that the Ramessid kingship, Seti I, Ramses II, Merneptah after that, these kings find their origin in a military power. And this is the first time we see this on the stage of kingship, which is a wonderful thing. You have these 3,000 years of history, long span of time. Every time it's a little different. Sometimes you have a god king creating a new religion. Sometimes it's a mercenary king who comes from a military background. But each time it's the same general authoritarianism, same patriarchal structure, using ideology to surround itself in an idealism that cannot be countered, that cannot be argued against. So we see here some of the precursors of this Ramessid family, and you get an idea that the Ramessids are rather foreign themselves. They are kings who come from the northeastern delta, and the name Seth of Seti I, this is the ancient name or ancient association of the god Baal. This is a Semitic god of West Asia. This is, these kings are willing to show and name themselves as something that is rather foreign to the 18th dynasty before it. And indeed, I argue that they're naming themselves Seth on purpose. They're like, those 18th dynasty kings, they did a number on you. It was all about their religion, and the sun god this and the sun god that. And it's just so tedious. And look at all that they did with it. We are different. We're hardworking soldier kings. We're there with our dudes, with our men. I walk amongst my soldiers. Ramses II is going to go to town with this, talking about the Battle of Kadesh, how we fought amongst the soldiers. He's the one that won the day. He's hanging out with this battalion and that battalion. They need to position themselves in a different way. They need to reinvent the kingship again in reaction to what had come before. Why? To recreate the same absolute power that we have seen repeating itself for a couple thousand years at this point. Now, for the Ramessids, war making is income creation. It's money making. It's putting your money in shell companies in Dubai and other places, and making sure that you're able to sell low and buy. Oh no, I did it the other way. You get it. I'm obviously not in this business, but it's your standard like finance bro kind of way of making a living, right? And this kind of income creation brings in a new base. Who's your base now? It's not going to be a bunch of priests. It's not going to be a bunch of engineers. It's going to be a bunch of soldiers, a bunch of guys who are like, that Seti, he's our guy. He made our family rich. We need to do what he says. And it creates a populism. So we have Egypt's first populist kings in the 19th dynasty. And I would say if you're looking at a time period to compare our current situation in the United States or globally with, I'd say it's a combination of all three of these guys, but you may find a lot of the populist stuff to work well in comparison. Now, here we see an image of Seti I, the father, with Ramses II, the son, as a child, and they're standing here at the Abydos temple built by Seti I, and they're standing in front of all of the names of the kings who have come before them. Every king who has existed on the landscape is here in this table of kings. They are showing, yeah, we may be soldiers, we may be base, we may not be as fancy as what was before in the 18th dynasty, but this is our lineage. We inherit all of it. All of it comes to us. So there is an overt religious claim in a temple space of the profundity of what it is they are doing. This is some deep and heavy theology. And yet at the same time, when Ramses comes in to build, we move from quantity over quality. Ramses II wants to show statue after statue. He wants to show that his image is everywhere on the landscape. Seti I, his father, built temples of extraordinary quality. Ramses II is like, no, I need it everywhere, I need it now. And he reused statues with an impunity that we have never seen before. Here we see a reuse of a Middle Kingdom statue. But Ramses II reused so many statues of Amenhotep III that he had to change his own portrait to match that reuse. Arguably, there were more portraits coming from an Amenhotep III style than there were an original Ramessid style. So it gives you an idea how we're dealing with a kind of man behind the curtain. There's a show going on here. You don't see what's actually happening behind. It's all the optics. It's all the beauty in front of the camera. This is a real celebrity king that Egypt is building at this time with Ramses II. And here you have the Contra Temple at Karnak, which is arguably built for his military base, where these military guys would come in and they would make offerings. They would bring their ear, like the human ear made of clay, bring that in and deposit it to this statue who hears all prayers. The king is made into a god, and we have a give and take between a king and his populace. And he's very clear to couch all of this in his own prosperity gospel of military victory. And even though the Battle of Kadesh, which he fought in year 5, which was a draw as far as historians can tell, and was no great victory, he will claim it as such. It's like saying that your inauguration was the biggest one ever. This is the same kind of thing that we need to create. And this is a litmus test, if you like. Anyone who spoke against this and said, well, did we win the Battle of Kadesh? Did he really win the day? Would be moved aside. This is a way of determining who is with you and who is against you. And the best image of the populist king, Ramses II, is arguably at Abu Simbel. And I wonder how many of you have been to this place where you see carved out of the live rock, though it has been moved by UNESCO in the 60s and early 70s, you see this king repeated 4 times. Note how big his figure is compared to Ray Harakti, who is not, he's just a tiny little guy in between that grandeur of kingship. It is the king who is bringing you this. And it is arguable that mercenary soldiers would have stopped at this place on their way to rape and pillage in Nubia and would have felt a connection to their guy, and he would have gotten a connection to him. Oops. Now, this Ramessid kingship brought its own unintended consequences. You're waiting for it, right? You know there's going to be some unintended consequences. What is this going to create? Well, Ramses needs a strong base. That base is a base of military soldiers. That's going to create its own problems of civil war. We'll get there. But there is also this idea of depending upon his sons, depending upon his daughters and the men who marry his daughters. The nepotism is a way of expanding his power very quickly, very effectively in the short term. But in the long term, this nepotism is indeed a monster that must be fed. And it is a monster that will break apart his regime from the inside out. But we've got good evidence of it. KV5, discovered in the Valley of the Kings, is the tomb for the sons of Ramses II There are hundreds of burials in here. This man had hundreds of wives and hundreds of sons, and each of them needed an income, needed some sort of position of power. And that is a pyramid scheme in its way that is not going to last for long. And when you empower all of these sons, grandsons, great grandsons, and when you live for 67 years, and you're going to have all kinds of competition on the other side of this. And so it is no surprise that just a few generations after the death of Ramses II, that it all falls apart in a civil war between relatives of Ramses II, who are each fighting over the populist crown. So we come to the end, and my conclusion is that the details are different. Circumstances change. The packaging and optics can be different. The reaction to what came before is a reaction setting itself up as something wholly unique, wholly different. And yet we are participating and part of a giant pyramid scheme that continues to go up, hit the apex to such point where the seeds of the destruction are being sown, and then it collapses. And then when it's rebuilt, it's bigger the next time. And it falls, the crash is bigger, but the rebuilding is bigger, and so on and so forth, until we find ourselves in the world that we live in today. And I would argue that we are very much the recipients of the ancient Egyptian autocrats. We are the recipients of the ancient Roman autocrats. We are the recipients of the British Empire and those absolute holders of authority. And what we do with it and how we deal with it is exactly what we're discussing today. Because the earth cannot sustain this kind of rule of the fathers, the control of the female, the beating of the children, the raping of the resources, seeing a forest as of value only when it's cut down into lumber and hoarded for the use of one of those patriarchs. When the elite are lauded and we are all taking selfies with them and we just consume them like our superstars. All of this is something that we are now looking at in this planet, on this world, as historians, as we ask, why the hell do we do what we do? Why does it matter? Why do we care? How are we going to face this problem on this earth as we move ahead on a planet that is not getting bigger, but in which the system of authoritarian power continues to want to grow? And then ask yourself, wait, what kind of ideology are they feeding us now? What are they telling us now? What can we do against this? Unless you think this is the most depressing thing you've ever heard, which kind of is, I would encourage you to look at the last chapter of my book, The Good Kings, in which I actually do set out a reasoned and rather hopeful notion for what we can do going forward into the future. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Kara. That was an amazing lecture, just wonderful and thought-provoking. I love it when talented people try to bring the past into current conversations and take these longue durée perspectives. I think we have a lot to learn from them. And obviously our audience agrees.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys for watching and giving your attention.
So you've kind of gone into one of the questions that came up in the chat of, why did you want to write this book now? It seems to have a kind of political charge, but also, I mean, clearly you're dealing with much larger issues as well.
Yeah, so much of the time books grab me and I say, my first book about Hatshepsut, my lit agent said, you should write a book about Hatshepsut. And I said, I can't do that. I do the 19th and 20th dynasties and she's 18th. And he's like, why don't you want to write a book about women in power? And then I went, oh, okay. And this book is very much the same. I'm like, living in the world that we were living in. I wrote this during COVID lockdown and riots in the streets, as people were saying that Black Lives Matter, right? And as we're discussing all of these things as a nation, and as so many of us who are recognizing our privilege as if for the first time, I started to think I need to write about history and my chosen specialization of history from that perspective. And then I taught a class on it and the words just poured out, and it wrote itself pretty fast, this one. And it just, I don't know, kind of hit me over the head with the system that I was living in during the lockdown of the time. And here's the other thing that I'll say, and then you can go to the next question, but lockdown made everyone think in a different way, because you weren't on a stage, you weren't doing the academic preening and, posturing. We were all in our homes, in our offices, doing our Zoom meetings. And it made me rather brave, I think, in a way that I might not have been had I not just been Zooming for the year and a half that I wrote that book. And UCLA Zoomed longer than other places, right? So I think in some ways being cut off helped me to say what I really thought, instead of saying what I thought people would rather hear. And that has its own issues, but I'll leave it there.
That's spectacular. Sometimes I think the best books, as you say, come out through a very organic and lived process. So that's wonderful to hear. I'm going to ask a question because I think it's really interesting. It's actually about what you didn't get to, and how does the Taharqa, and the 25th dynasty factor into your general argument?
Yeah. Taharqa is really important for modern day America. And I have a slide in my Taharqa lecture, and I discussed this in the chapter, where I have Martin Luther King. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day yesterday, right? Where I have Martin Luther King next to an image of Taharqa. And my point in that is that the Nubians were brutally colonized and occupied by Egyptians for millennia. And this was no pleasure cruise. This was no Levant either. This was no equal playing field in many ways. This was a brutal occupation to source gold and minerals as quickly, completely, and thoroughly as they could. In so doing, the unintended consequence is the creation of a secondary state that sold itself as mercenary soldiers to the Egyptians, which is why we still have that stereotypical and racist trope of the Black soldiers in a Hollywood movie with white Egyptians, right? As racist as it gets. But that Nubian reaction is its counter reaction against Egypt. The Taharqa that is imperializing Egypt and controlling Egypt must use the writing system of the Egyptians, the language of the Egyptians, the dominant cultural ways of the Egyptians to win the hearts and minds of the Egyptians. And the Martin Luther King analogy is that he had to use Christianity, which was imposed upon an African people, brought here against their will, their religion, names, and culture taken from them forcibly. And with that religion of Christianity imposed, that was still the base of power that he had to create a resistance against dominant white cultural power. So you have to work with the system that you're in. I mean, many of us don't even sit around and think on a daily basis, holy crap, we're using Roman letters. And that given where you and your people came from, well, the long story would be, well, Britain was colonized and women, fancy elite women were raped, and the country was taken, however you understand that. And the letters of the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet, were imposed. And that was then imposed on Ireland. And then that was imposed on the United States. And here we are using them. And only a couple thousand years have passed since that imposition of that alphabet. But we don't think about it. And it was no different with Taharqa, arguably. You don't think, oh, yes, my people used to have this different religious and language system. You do connect with the dominant system and culture of power. And that's where it gets really messy post-colonially. And that's why that story needs its own lecture, in a sense, because it's so complicated and deals with the indigenous versus the non-indigenous and what does this mean. So that's just a short little snippet of that. But more detail in that book. And it was one of the harder ones for me to write, to not impose Egypt having all the power, because the Nubians, the Kushites, do come back and create the first African empire. I don't think Egypt was an empire. Egypt was a hegemony that could get to the Levant and then wreak havoc in the south. This place, this Jebel Barkal Empire, for 100 years went all the way up to West Asia and ran things like an empire. They didn't run things like an authoritarian kingship in Egyptian style. There was no direct rule because empires cannot be run that way. There's more one can say, but yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, the 25th, 26th dynasties are just fascinating. Sort of building off one thread in that question that takes us back into ancient Egypt. Someone had asked if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between sort of Akhenaten's Egyptian concept of monotheism and what kind of influence or connection there might be to early Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to say Judaism, but you skipped a religion. So that's okay.
Well, our questioner skipped a religion, so feel free to go back if you wish.
It's almost easier to talk about Egyptian religion's influence on Christianity, actually, because the amount of time between Akhenaten's religion and around 1350 and the beginnings of Judaism, when is it written down? Do we go with 750? Do we go with 650 BCE? How are we going to deal with that? But there's a big stretch of time and not a whole lot of connection. And I've spoken about this before, and I do touch upon that in the book, but Christianity is a little easier because you still have an Egyptian religious space that the Jewish Jesus cult goes into. And so the idea of the divine mother holding the divine son, the pietà, or not the pietà, sorry, the mother and child, that's a very Egyptian thing. You know, Isis holding Horus, Virgin Mary holding Jesus as a baby, very Egyptian. The idea of a divinity born as such. So it's born, people hear about it, and the idea of a divinity that creates himself, that's so Egyptian. This idea of the divine birth, that the woman is just a vessel, is extraordinarily Egyptian. And that's what most of Egyptian religion is based on, that the sun creates his own self. Osiris creates his own self. The Egyptians are much more sexual and bodily about how they say that. That's a different lecture for a different day. But it's a very similar thing. And one could go on, but yeah, there's a lot there. And I would encourage you to read a book by, it's a strange book, but it's a wonderful book written by, I think he's a Cambridge ancient economist. He's dead now. And his name is Keith Hopkins, Hopkins. And he wrote a book called A World Full of Gods. And it makes these connections between Christianity and polytheistic religions. So yeah, look there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we have time for a very short question, and a couple of our audience members have wanted you to end on a hopeful note. So could you share one aspect of the final chapter of your book? And
yeah, okay, now I don't want to be too much of a downer, but I was just saying this to someone and they looked at me like I was crazy, but I think COVID in a weird, horrible way is kind of a beautiful thing, because what we're doing to the earth is making the earth feel like crap. It's all of us are just kind of, and now all of us also feel like crap. And so there's this kind of equalizer, this all of us coming together. Some people want to deny it, say it isn't real, it doesn't exist, but we all have to be together in this moment where the health of our planet and our survival depends on our cohesion and our ability to live sustainably. And there is no other way to look at a pandemic with 8 billion people on the planet except in that way. And what I will say, you saw the graph at the end where it's going up and up and up, and you're like, where does it stop? Well, the earth in front of you, and let me go to the next slide if you want to hear more about me and podcasts and other things. Quick, get your iPhone out and put, because I have a podcast. But the earth ain't getting any bigger. And these 8 billion people we now have on the planet, we need a sustainable place to live. And the reason that this graph cannot keep going up and up and up is the very fact that the earth is not growing any larger. And there is a stopping point. And that stopping point is imposed upon us. And I am going to take the hopeful route and say that while we're going to go through some stuff, and indeed we are going through some stuff, and one could argue we're losing 2 to 3% of the population of the United States and maybe the world, we can discuss. But it's an interesting thing to see the obstacles put in our way such that we must create a different system. And from that perspective, and I talk about this in much more detail about the kinds of people who are now included in power and the pushback against those people, women, children, people of color, non-binary people, and what that means, and how ultimately unsettling that is for the patriarchy, however you define that. I find that also very hopeful, because the more hatefully people respond at the inclusion of the many or the all, the more they reveal themselves for the grabby hoarders that they are.
Wow, spectacular. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. Thank you, Dr. Cooney. Thank you to all of you who attended, and I hope you'll come back and join us again for the Archaeology Hour and for Archaeology Abridged next week. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, guys. It was super fun.